Chapter 1. It was cold and dark outside, and the rain did not stop for a minute. But in the little living room of number 10 Castle Road, it was nice and warm. Old Mr. Warner and his son Ronald were playing chess while Mrs. Warner sat and watched them. The old woman was happy because her husband and her son were good friends, and they liked to be together. Ronald is a good son, she thought. We waited a long time for him, and I was nearly 40 when he was born, but we are a happy family, and old Mrs. Warner smiled. It was true. Ronald was young and laughed a lot, but his mother and father laughed with him. They had not got much money, but they were a very happy little family. It was true. Ronald was young and laughed a lot, but his mother and father laughed with him. They had not got much money, but they were a very happy little family. The two men didn't talk because they were playing carefully. The room was quiet, but the sound of the rain was worse now, and they could hear it on the windows. Suddenly, old Mr. Warner looked up and said, "Listen to the rain." "Yes, it's a bad night," Ronald replied. "It's not a good night to be outside, but is your friend, Miles Morris, coming tonight?" "Yes, that's right. He's coming at about 8 o'clock, the old man said, but perhaps this rain." Mr. Warner did not finish because just then the young man heard a noise. "Listen," Ronald said. "There's someone at the door now." "I did not hear a noise," his father replied, but he got up from his chair and went to open the front door. Mrs. Warner got up too and began to put things away. Mr. Warner said, come in, Miles. It's wonderful to see you again. What a bad night. Give me your coat and then come into the living room. It's nice and warm in there." The front door was open, and in the living room, Mrs. Warner and Ronald felt the cold. Then Mr. Warner came back into the living room with a big, red-faced man. "This is Miles Morris," Mr. Warner told his wife and son. "We were friends when we were young. We worked together before Miles went to India. Miles, this is my wife, and this is our son, Ronald." "Pleased to meet you," Miles Morris said. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Morris," Mrs. Warner replied. "Please come and sit down." "Yes, come on, Miles," Mr. Warner said. "Over here, it's nice and warm." "Thank you," the big man replied as he sat down. "Let's have some whiskey," old Mr. Warner said. "You need something to warm you on a cold night." He took out a bottle of whiskey, and the two old friends began to drink and talk. The little family listened with interest to this visitor from far away, and he told them many strange stories. Chapter 2. After a while, Miles Morris stopped talking, and Mr. Warner said to his wife and son, "Miles was a soldier in India for 22 years. India is a wonderful country." "Yes," Ronald said, "I'd like to go there." "Oh, Ronald," his mother cried. She was afraid because she didn't want to lose her son. "I wanted to go to India too," her husband said. "But it's better for you here," the soldier said quickly. "But you saw a lot of strange and wonderful things in India. I want to see them too one day," Mr. Warner said. The soldier put down his whiskey. "No," he cried. "Stay here." Old Mr. Warner did not stop. "But your stories were interesting," he said to Miles Morris. "What did you begin to say about a monkey's paw?" "Nothing," Morris answered quickly. "Well, nothing important." "A monkey's paw?" Mrs. Warner asked. "Come on, Mr. Morris, tell us about it," Ronald said. Morris took his whiskey in his hand, but suddenly he put it down again. Slowly, he put his hand into the pocket of his coat, and the Warner family watched him. "What is it? What is it?" Mrs. Warner cried. Mrs. Warner moved back, afraid, but her son Ronald took it and looked at it carefully. "Well, what is it?" Mr. Warner asked his friend. "Look at it," the soldier answered. "It's a little paw, a monkey's paw." "A monkey's paw," Ronald said, and he laughed. "Why do you carry a monkey's paw in your pocket, Mr. Morris?" he asked the old soldier. "Well, you see," Morris said, "this monkey's paw is magic." Ronald laughed again, but the soldier said, "Don't laugh, boy. Remember, you're young. I'm old now, and in India I saw many strange things." He stopped talking for a minute, and then he said, "This monkey's paw can do strange and wonderful things. An old Indian gave the paw to one of my friends. My friend was a soldier too. This paw is magic because it can give 3 wishes to 3 people. But these 3 wishes don't bring happiness," the soldier said. "The old Indian wanted to teach us something. It's never good to want to change things." An old Indian gave the monkey's paw to one of my friends. "Well, did your friend have 3 wishes?" Ronald asked the old soldier. "Yes," Morris answered quietly, "and his 3rd and last wish was to die." Mr. and Mrs. Warner listened to the story, and they felt afraid, but Ronald asked, "And did he die?" "Yes, he did," Morris said. "He had no family, so his things came to me when he died. The monkey's paw was with his things, but he told me about it before he died." Tom Morris finished quietly. "What were his first 2 wishes then?" Ronald asked. "What did he ask for?" "I don't know. He didn't want to tell me," the soldier answered. For a minute or 2, everybody was quiet. But then Ronald said, "And you, Mr. Morris, did you have 3 wishes?" "Yes, I did," Morris answered. "I was young. I wanted many things, an expensive car, money." Morris stopped for a minute, and then he said with difficulty, "My wife and my young daughter died in an accident in the car. Without them, I didn't want the money, so in the end, I wished to lose it. But it was too late. My wife and my child were dead." The room was very quiet. The Warner family looked at the unhappy face of the old soldier. Then Mr. Warner said, "Why do you want the paw now? You don't need it. You can give it to someone." "How can I give it to someone?" the soldier said. "The monkey's paw brings unhappiness with it." "Well, give it to me," Mr. Warner said. "Perhaps this time it—" "No," Miles Morris cried. "You're my friend. I can't give it to you." Then, after a minute, he said, "I can't give it to you, but of course, you can take it from me. But remember, this monkey's paw brings unhappiness." Miles Morris looked unhappy, But Mr. Warner did not want to wait. "What do I do now?" he asked his friend. The soldier said nothing, and Mr. Warner asked him again, "What do I do now?" At first, the old soldier did not answer, but in the end he said quietly, "Okay, but remember, be careful. Think before you make your wish." "Yes, yes," Mr. Warner said. "Take the paw in your right hand and then make your wish," Miles Morris said. Just then, old Mrs. Warner stood up and she began to get the dinner. Her husband looked at her. Then he smiled and said to her, "Come on, help me. What can I wish for? We need money, of course." Mrs. Warner laughed, but she thought for a minute and then she said, "Well, I'm getting old now, and sometimes it's difficult to do everything. Perhaps I need 4 hands and not 2. Yes, ask the paw to give me 2 more hands." "Okay, then," her husband said, and he took the monkey's paw in his right hand. Everybody watched him, and for a minute he waited. Then he opened his mouth to make his wish. Suddenly, Miles Morris stood up and cried, "Don't do it!" The old soldier's face was white. Ronald and his mother laughed, but Mr. Warner looked at Miles's face. Old Mr. Warner was afraid, and he put the monkey's paw into his pocket. After a minute or two, they sat down at the table and began to have dinner. The soldier told the family many strange and wonderful stories about India. They forgot the monkey's paw, and because the soldier's stories were interesting, they asked him many questions about India. When Miles Morris stood up to leave, it was very late. "Thank you for a very nice evening," Morris said to the family. "And thank you for a very good dinner," he said to Mrs. Warner. "It was a wonderful evening for us, Miles," old Mr. Warner answered. "Your stories were very interesting. Our life isn't very exciting, and we don't have the money to visit India, so please come again soon. You can tell us some more stories about India." Then the old soldier put on his coat. He said goodbye to the Warner family and went out into the rain. Chapter 3. It was nearly midnight. In their warm living room, the 2 old people and their son sat and talked about the soldiers' stories. "India is a wonderful country," Mr. Warner said. "What exciting stories. It was a good evening." Mrs. Warner stood up to take some things into the kitchen, but she stopped and listened to Ronald and his father. "Yes," Ronald said. "Morris told some interesting stories, but of course some of them weren't true." "Oh, Ronald," Mrs. Warner said. "Well, I think you're right, Ronald," his mother said. "I don't know," Mr. Warner said quietly. "Perhaps the story was true. Strange things can happen sometimes." Mrs. Warner looked at her husband. "Did you give some money to Tom Morris for that paw?" she asked. "We don't have money to give away for nothing." Mrs. Warner was angry now. "Well, yes," her husband answered. "I did, but not much. And at first, he didn't want to take it. He wanted the monkey's paw." "Well, he can't have it," Ronald laughed. "It's our paw now, and we're going to be rich and happy. Come on, Father, make a wish." Old Mr. Warner took the paw from his pocket. "Okay, Ronald, But what am I going to ask for? I have everything. You, your mother. What do I need? Money, of course, Ronald answered quickly. We need money. You're always thinking about money. That's because we haven't got very much of it. With money, you can pay for this house. It can be your house. Go on, Father. Wish for 40,000 pounds. Ronald stopped talking, and his old father thought for a minute. The room was quiet, and they could hear the rain on the windows. Then Mr. Warner took the monkey's paw in his right hand. He was afraid, but he looked at his wife, and she smiled at him. Go on, she said. Slowly and carefully, Mr. Warner said, I wish for 40,000 pounds. Suddenly, he gave a cry, and Mrs. Warner and Ronald ran to him. What's the matter, Father? Ronald asked. It moved, Mr. Warner cried. The monkey's paw, it moved. They looked at the paw. It was now on the floor and not in the old man's hand. The family watched it and waited, but it did not move again. So the little family sat down again and waited. Nothing happened. The noise of the rain on the windows was louder now, and their small living room did not feel nice and warm. Mrs. Warner said, It's cold. Let's go to bed. Mr. Warner did not answer, and in the end, Ronald said, Well, there's no money, Father. Your friend's story wasn't true. But Mr. Warner did not answer. He sat quietly and said nothing. After some time, Mrs. Warner said to her husband, Are you okay? Yes, yes, the old man answered, but for a minute or two I was afraid. Well, we needed that money, Mrs. Warner said, but we aren't going to get it. I'm tired. I'm going to bed. After Mrs. Warner went to bed, the two men sat and smoked for some time. Then Ronald said, Well, Father, I'm going to bed too. Perhaps the money is in a bag under your bed. Good night, Father. And Ronald laughed and went out of the room. Old Mr. Warner sat in the cold living room for a long time. The candle died, and it was dark. Suddenly, the old man saw a face at the window. Quickly, he looked again, but there was nothing there. He felt afraid. Slowly, he stood up and left the cold, dark room. Chapter 4. The next morning, the winter sun came through the window, and the house felt nice and warm again. Mr. Warner felt better and smiled at his wife and son. The family sat down to have breakfast and began to talk about the day. The monkey's paw was on a small table near the window, but nobody looked at it, and nobody thought about it. I'm going to the shops this morning, Mrs. Warner said. I want to get something nice for dinner. Are you going to come with me? She asked her husband. No, I'm going to have a quiet morning. I'm going to read, her husband answered. Well, I'm not going to go out this evening, Ronald said, so we can go to bed early tonight. We were very late last night. And we aren't going to have stories about monkey's paws, Mrs. Warner said angrily. Why did we listen to your friend? She asked her husband. A monkey's paw can't give you things. She stopped, but the two men did not answer her. 40,000 pounds, she said quietly. We needed that money. Just then, Ronald looked at the clock and stood up. I'm going to work, he said. Perhaps the postman has the money for you in a letter. Remember, I want some of it too. Ronald laughed, and his mother laughed too. Don't laugh, son, Mr. Warner said. Miles Morris is an old friend, and he thinks the story is true. Perhaps it is. Well, leave some of the money for me, Ronald laughed again. His mother laughed too, and she went to the door with him. Goodbye, Mother, Ronald said happily. Get something nice for dinner this evening at the shops. I'm always hungry after a day at work. I know you are, Mrs. Warner answered. Ronald left the house and walked quickly down the road. His mother stood at the door for some time, watching him. The winter sun was warm, but suddenly she felt very cold. Chapter 5. Slowly, old Mrs. Warner went back into the house. Her husband looked up and saw something strange in her face. What's the matter? He asked. Nothing, his wife answered, and she sat down to finish her breakfast. She began to think about Miles Morris again, and suddenly said to her husband, Your friend drank a lot of whiskey last night. A monkey's paw. What a story. Mr. Warner did not answer her, because just then the postman arrived. He brought 2 letters for them, but there was no money in them. After breakfast, the 2 old people forgot about the money and the monkey's paw. Later in the day, at about 2 o'clock, Mr. and Mrs. Warner sat down to eat and then began to talk about money again. They did not have much money, so they often needed to talk about it. That 40,000 pounds, Mrs. Warner said, we need it. But it didn't come this morning, her husband answered. Let's forget it. Then he said, but that thing moved. The monkey's paw moved in my hand. Miles's story was true. You drank a lot of whiskey last night. Perhaps the paw didn't move, Mrs. Warner answered. It moved, Mr. Warner cried angrily. At first his wife did not answer, but then she said, well, Ronald laughed about it. Suddenly she stopped talking. She stood up and went over to the window. What's the matter? Her husband asked. There's a man in front of our house, Mrs. Warner answered. He's a stranger, very tall and well-dressed. He's looking at our house. Oh, no, it's okay. He's going away. Come and sit down. Finish eating, Mr. Warner said. The old woman did not listen to her husband. He isn't going away, she went on. He's coming back. I don't know him. He's a stranger. Yes, he's very well dressed. Suddenly, Mrs. Warner stopped. She was very excited. He's coming to the door. Perhaps he's bringing the money. And she ran out of the room to open the front door. The tall, well-dressed stranger stood there. For a minute he said nothing, but then he began, Good afternoon. I'm looking for Mr. and Mrs. Warner. Well, I'm Mrs. Warner, the old woman answered. What can I do for you? At first the stranger did not answer, but then he said, Mrs. Warner, I'm from Jack and Jones. Can I come in and talk to you? Jack and Jones had a big factory, and Ronald Warner worked there on the machinery. Yes, of course, Mrs. Warner answered. Please come in. The well-dressed stranger came into the little living room, and Mr. Warner stood up. Are you Mr. Warner? The stranger began. Then he went on, I'm from Jack and Jones. Mrs. Warner looked at the stranger and thought, perhaps he has the money, but why Jack and Jones? And his face is very unhappy. Why? Suddenly the old woman was afraid. "Please sit down," Mr. Warner began, but now his wife could not wait. "What's the matter?" she cried. "Is Ronald?" She could not finish the question. The stranger did not look at their faces, and Mr. Warner began to be afraid too. "Please tell us," he said. "I'm very sorry," the man from Jack and Jones began. He stopped for a minute, then started again. "I'm very sorry, but this morning there was an accident at the factory." "What's the matter? Is Ronald okay?" Mrs. Warner cried again. "Well," the man began slowly. "Is he in hospital?" the old woman asked, very afraid now. "Yes, but—" The stranger looked at Mrs. Warner's face and stopped. "Is he dead? Is Ronald dead?" Mr. Warner asked quietly. "Dead?" Mrs. Warner cried. "Oh, no, please, not dead, not Ronald, not our son." Suddenly, the old woman stopped because she saw the stranger's face. Then the two old people knew. Their son was dead. Old Mrs. Warner began to cry quietly, and Mr. Warner put his arm around her. Sometime later, the man from Jack and Jones said it was the machinery, an accident. Ronald called, "Help!" The men heard him and ran to him quickly, but they could do nothing. The next minute, he was in the machinery. "I'm very, very sorry," he finished. For a minute or two, the room was quiet. At last, Mrs. Warner said, "Our son, dead. We're never going to see him again. What are we going to do without him?" Her husband said, "He was our son. We loved him." Then Mrs. Warner asked the stranger, "Can we see him? Can we see our son? Please take me to him. I want to see my son." But the stranger answered quickly. "No," he said. "It's better not to see him. They couldn't stop the machinery quickly. He was in there for a long time, and at first they couldn't get him out. He was—" The man stopped. Then he said, "Don't go to see him." The stranger went over to the window because he did not want to see the faces of the two old people. He said nothing, but he stood there for some time, waiting. Then he went back to the old people and began to talk again. "There's one more thing," he said. "Your son worked for Jack and Jones for 5 years, and he was a good worker. Now Jack and Jones want to help you at this unhappy time." Again the stranger stopped. After a minute, he began again. "Jack and Jones want to give you some money." Then he put something into Mr. Warner's hand. Old Mr. Warner did not look at the money in his hand. Slowly, he stood up and looked at the stranger, afraid. "How much?" Mr. Warner asked very quietly. He did not want to hear the answer. £40,000, the stranger said. Chapter 6. 2 days later, in the big new cemetery 3 miles from their house, the two old people said goodbye to their dead son. Then they went back to their dark old house. They did not want to live without Ronald, but they waited for something good to happen, something to help them. The days went by very slowly. Sometimes they did not talk because there was nothing to say without Ronald, and so the days felt very long. Then, one night, about a week later, Mrs. Warner got out of bed because she could not sleep. She sat by the window and watched and waited for her son. Ronald did not come, and she began to cry quietly. In the dark, her husband heard her and called, "Come back to bed. It's cold out there." "It's colder for my son," his wife answered. "He's out there in the cold cemetery." Mrs. Warner did not go back to bed, but Mr. Warner was old and tired, and the bed was warm. In the end, he went to sleep again. Suddenly he heard a cry from his wife. "The paw," she cried. "The monkey's paw." She went back to the bed and stood there. "What is it? What's the matter?" Mr. Warner cried. He sat up in bed. "What's the matter?" he thought. "Why is she excited? What's she talking about?" He looked at his wife. Her face was very white in the dark. "I want it," she said quietly, "and you've got it. Give it to me, please." "What?" Mr. Warner asked. "The monkey's paw," Mrs. Warner said. "Where is it?" "It's downstairs," Mr. Warner answered. "Why?" Mrs. Warner began to laugh and cry. "We can have 2 more wishes," she cried. "We had 1, but there are 2 more." "Oh no, not again. Think, woman," Mr. Warner cried. But Mrs. Warner did not listen. "Quickly," she said, "go and get the paw. We're going to wish for our boy to come back to us." "No," Mr. Warner cried. "You're mad." Get it quickly," Mrs. Warner cried again. Mr. Warner said again, "Think, woman, think. Our boy was in the machinery for a long time. They didn't want to show him to us. Think. Do you want to see his body?" "Yes, he's my son. I'm not afraid of him," she answered. "You don't understand," Mr. Warner said sadly, but he went downstairs to look for the monkey's paw. In the living room it was dark, and Mr. Warner did not have a candle. Slowly he went across the room and put out his hand for the monkey's paw. He touched it and quickly took his hand away again. "No," he thought, "I can't. I don't want to see Ronald, his face, after he was in the machinery. No." Then he thought about his wife, and he put out his hand and took the paw. In the bedroom, his wife waited. She saw the paw in Mr. Warner's hand and cried, "Quick, make the wish." "I can't," Mr. Warner answered. "Remember, he died in the machinery. Make the wish. I'm not afraid of my own son," Mrs. Warner cried again. Mr. Warner looked sadly at his wife, but he took the paw in his right hand and said slowly, "I wish for my son Ronald to come back to us." Then he sat down in the nearest chair. But Mrs. Warner went over to the window and looked out into the road. She stayed there for a long time and did not move. Nothing happened. The monkey's paw could not do it. "Thank God," Mr. Warner said, and he went back to bed. Soon, Mrs. Warner went to bed too. Chapter 7. But they did not sleep. They waited and they listened. In the end, Mr. Warner got up to get a candle because the dark made him more afraid. He began to go downstairs, but suddenly he heard a noise at the front door. He stopped and he listened. He could not move. Then the noise came again. This time he ran. He ran upstairs back into the bedroom and he closed the door behind him. But again the noise came. "What's that?" Mrs. Warner cried, and she sat up in bed. "Nothing. Go to sleep again," her husband answered. But Mrs. Warner listened, and the noise came again. "It's Ronald! It's Ronald!" she cried. "I'm going to open the door for him." "No," he cried. "Think, but it's my boy. "It's Ronald," she answered. "No, don't go. Don't," her husband cried again. But Mrs. Warner did not listen to him. She opened the bedroom door and ran from the room. "I'm coming, Ronald. I'm coming," she called. Mr. Warner ran after her. "Stop," he cried. "Remember, Ronald died in the machinery. You don't want to see him." For a minute, Mrs. Warner stopped and looked at her husband, but then the noise came again, and she began to run downstairs. "Help me! Help me!" she called to her husband, but Mr. Warner did not move. "The paw," he thought. "Where's the monkey's paw?" He ran back into the bedroom. "Quick," he thought. "Where is it?" At first, he could not find it in the dark. Ah, there it was. He had it. Just at that minute, he heard his wife downstairs. "Wait, wait, Ronald. I'm coming," she cried. She began to open the front door. At the same time, Mr. Warner took the monkey's paw in his right hand and made his third wish. Mrs. Warner gave a long, unhappy cry, and her husband ran down to her. She stood by the open door. Very afraid, old Mr. Warner looked out into the dark. The road was dark and quiet, and there was nobody there.